Equals dead girl on the wall. I should have known something was wrong the moment I signed the lease. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, had been too eager, too willing to overlook my less-than-stellar credit score and lack of references. She'd practically thrust the keys into my hands before I'd finished the walkthrough, her weathered fingers trembling as she spoke about the good bones of the old Victorian house. "You'll love it here," she'd said, avoiding my eyes. "Very quiet neighborhood. Very peaceful." The way she'd hesitated on that last word should have been my first warning. The house stood at the end of Maple Street, separated from its neighbors by overgrown hedges and a wrought iron fence that had seen better decades. Built in 1892, according to the Historical Society plaque by the front door, it had been converted into 3 apartments sometime in the 1960s. Mine was the top floor, accessed by a narrow staircase that creaked with each step, as if the wood was sighing under the weight of years. The apartment itself was spacious enough for a graduate student's budget: 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with tall windows that let in streams of dusty sunlight. The walls were covered in dated wallpaper, faded roses on cream backgrounds, peeling at the edges in places. I made a mental note to ask Mrs. Chen about painting over it. It was while I was measuring the living room for furniture that I first noticed her. The wallpaper had a strange irregularity along the far wall, a section where the pattern didn't quite align. At first glance, it looked like water damage or poor installation, but as I stared at it longer, the discolored patches began to take on a different quality. The faded roses seemed to form the outline of something else entirely, the suggestion of a human figure, arms outstretched, head tilted at an unnatural angle. I blinked hard and looked again. Just wallpaper. Just my imagination, fed by too much coffee and too little sleep from weeks of apartment hunting. I made another note, definitely painting over the wallpaper. The first week passed uneventfully. I moved in my modest collection of furniture, started classes at the university, and began to settle into a routine. The apartment was quiet, just as Mrs. Chen had promised. Sometimes too quiet. The old house seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it, creating pockets of silence so complete they felt almost solid. It was during my second week that I began to notice the cold spot. The living room was generally warm, heated by an old radiator that clanged and hissed throughout the day. But there was one area, directly in front of the wall with the irregular wallpaper, where the temperature dropped noticeably. Not drastically, maybe 10 degrees, but enough to raise goosebumps on my arms whenever I passed through it. I assumed it was a draft. Old houses were full of them, gaps in the walls where the wind could seep through. I made a mental note to mention it to Mrs. Chen, then promptly forgot about it as midterm papers began piling up. But the cold spot didn't forget about me. I started unconsciously avoiding that section of the room, taking longer routes around my coffee table to avoid walking through the chill. When I sat on my couch to study, I found myself pulling on sweaters even when the rest of the apartment was perfectly comfortable. The cold seemed to have a weight to it, a presence that pressed against my skin like invisible hands. It was 3 weeks into my tenancy when I first heard the scratching. I was lying in bed, halfway between sleep and wakefulness, when the sound drifted through the thin walls. Soft at first, almost rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood. I assumed it was mice in the walls, or perhaps the old plumbing settling. Old houses made strange noises. I was still learning the vocabulary of creaks and sighs that filled the darkness each night. But as the nights passed, the scratching became more persistent. Always in the living room wall, always in the same spot where the wallpaper pattern didn't align. I started leaving my bedroom door open so I could listen for it, trying to identify its source. Sometimes it sounded like clawing, desperate and frantic. Other times it was methodical, patient, as if someone was carefully working at something from the other side of the wall. During the day, I would examine the wall closely, running my hands along the faded roses and cream background. The wallpaper was loose in places, bubbling away from whatever lay beneath. When I pressed against it, I could feel a slight give, as if there was empty space behind the plaster. I finally called Mrs. Chen about the scratching sounds. "Mice," she said quickly, before I'd even finished describing the noise. Old house, lots of mice. I'll have someone come look at it. No one ever came. By my second month in the apartment, I had begun to feel watched. It started as a prickling sensation between my shoulder blades whenever I sat with my back to the irregular wall. The feeling would persist until I turned around, but there was never anything there except the faded wallpaper and that persistent cold spot. The sensation grew stronger over the following weeks. I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder while cooking dinner, certain that someone was standing behind me. When I worked at my desk, positioned against the far wall to avoid the cold spot, I could feel eyes boring into the back of my neck. The feeling was so strong that I eventually moved my desk to face the room, but that somehow made it worse. Now I was looking directly at the wall, at that section where the pattern didn't align, and the longer I stared at it, the more convinced I became that the discolored patches were shifting, rearranging themselves when I wasn't paying attention. Sleep became elusive. Every night, I would lie in bed listening for the scratching, and every night it would come. Sometimes soft and hesitant, sometimes urgent and demanding. I began keeping a flashlight by my bed, and when the sounds became too insistent, I would creep into the living room and shine the beam at the wall. The irregularity in the wallpaper seemed to be growing. What had once been a vague human outline was becoming more defined. The discolored patches had darkened, creating shadows that suggested facial features, the curve of shoulders, the length of arms. It was as if someone was slowly pressing themselves against the other side of the wall, leaving an impression that bled through the layers of plaster and paper. I started taking pictures with my phone, documenting the changes. When I compared them side by side, the progression was undeniable. Day by day, the figure was becoming clearer, more detailed. I could make out what looked like long hair spreading across the wall, and the suggestion of a dress or nightgown. The head was tilted at an angle that made my neck ache just looking at it. In my fourth month in the apartment, I found the newspaper clippings. I had been cleaning out the small closet in the second bedroom when I discovered a manila envelope wedged behind the shelf brackets. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, all from the local paper, all from different decades. The headlines made my stomach tighten: young woman found dead in Victorian home, 1967, tenant dies mysteriously in Maple Street apartment, 1983, third death reported at historic house, 1995, another tragedy strikes troubled residents, 2006. I spread the clippings across my kitchen table with shaking hands. Each article told a similar story: a young woman, living alone in the top-floor apartment, found dead under mysterious circumstances. The causes varied: suicide, accidental death, undetermined causes, but the location was always the same. My apartment. My living room. The most recent clipping included a photograph of the victim, a graduate student named Sarah Chen. The name made me pause. Chen. Like my landlord. The article mentioned that Sarah had been found by her aunt, who owned the building. I stared at Sarah's photograph for a long time. She was pretty. Maybe 25, with long dark hair and serious eyes. According to the article, she had been discovered sitting against the living room wall, apparently having died in her sleep. No signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death. The medical examiner had ruled it a heart attack, though Sarah had no history of heart problems. The wall where she'd been found was described as having unusual staining that couldn't be cleaned. That night, the scratching was more violent than ever. It woke me from deep sleep, a frantic clawing that seemed to come from directly behind my headboard. But when I went into the living room, flashlight in hand, the sounds were definitely coming from the far wall, the wall where the wallpaper pattern didn't align. The figure in the wall was almost complete now. I could see the clear outline of a young woman, her arms pressed against the surface as if she was trying to push through. Her head was tilted back at that horrible angle, and for the first time, I could make out the dark patches that might have been eyes, a smaller patch that could have been a mouth opened in a silent scream. I couldn't bring myself to get close enough to examine it properly. The cold spot had expanded, and now the entire section of wall radiated a chill that seemed to reach into my bones. When I pointed the flashlight directly at the figure, the shadows seemed to writhe and shift, as if responding to the light. I tried calling Mrs. Chen again the next morning, but the number had been disconnected. A call to the property management company listed on my lease yielded no answers. They claimed to have no record of the building under that address. Desperate for answers, I visited the local historical society. The elderly volunteer who helped me was eager to share what she knew about the Victorian house on Maple Street. "Oh yes, troubled history, that place," she said, pulling out a thick file. "Built by the Morrison family, but they lost it in the crash of 1929. Been rental property ever since. Always seems to have problems keeping tenants, especially in that top apartment." She showed me old photographs of the house, including some interior shots from the 1920s. In one photograph, taken in what was now my living room, I could see the original wallpaper, the same faded roses on cream background, but new and vibrant. And there, barely visible in the corner of the image, was a young woman in a white dress, standing exactly where the cold spot now resided. "Who is that?" I asked, pointing to the figure. The volunteer adjusted her glasses and squinted at the photograph. "Strange," she murmured. "I don't see anyone there." But I could see her clearly. A young woman with long dark hair and serious eyes, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. She looked exactly like Sarah Chen from the newspaper clipping. I left the historical society with more questions than answers, but one thing had become clear: whatever was happening in my apartment had been happening for decades. The figure in the wall wasn't just Sarah Chen, it was all of them, every young woman who had died in that room, somehow pressed into the very structure of the building. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in my kitchen with all the lights on, afraid to enter the living room. But I could hear the scratching anyway, more insistent than ever. It had developed a rhythm now, almost like Morse code, dots and dashes of desperation tapped out against the inside of the wall. As the night wore on, the scratching was joined by other sounds. A soft tapping, like fingernails against glass. A rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. And underneath it all, so faint I might have imagined it, what sounded like whispering. When dawn finally broke, I gathered the courage to look into the living room. The figure in the wall had changed again. The outline was sharper now, more three-dimensional. It looked as if someone had pressed themselves so hard against the other side of the wall that they were beginning to break through. The wallpaper was actually bulging outward in places, creating the suggestion of fingers, of facial features, of a body trying to push through into my world. And for the first time, I noticed something else. The cold spot had moved. It was no longer confined to the area in front of the wall. It had shifted, following me as I moved around the apartment. When I stood in the kitchen, the chill pressed against my back. When I sat at my desk, it settled around my shoulders like invisible arms. She wasn't just in the wall anymore. She was with me. I've been packing for 3 days now, but I can't seem to leave. Every time I reach for the door, the cold wraps around me like chains, holding me back. The scratching has spread to other walls now, following me from room to room. And the figure, I can see her face clearly now, pressed against the wallpaper from the inside. Her mouth is open, and her eyes are dark holes that seem to look directly at me. Sometimes, when the scratching is loudest, I press my hand against the wall and feel something press back from the other side. The wallpaper is warm there, pulsing like a heartbeat. I understand now why Mrs. Chen was so eager to rent the apartment, why she avoided my calls, why the property management company has no record of this place. I understand why there were newspaper clippings hidden in the closet, and why every tenant has been a young woman living alone. The wall is hungry. It collects us, presses us into itself, adds our essence to the pattern of faded roses and cream background. Sarah Chen learned this too late, just like the others before her. Just like I'm learning it now. The scratching has stopped. The apartment is silent again, that complete silence that feels solid and heavy. I'm sitting in front of the wall now, and I can feel the cold seeping into my bones. The figure is so clear I could reach out and touch her face through the wallpaper. Her mouth is moving, forming words I can almost hear. She's not trying to get out anymore. She's making room.